That's all you have to do. Even when we're done, it'll go straight to the cloud. We're good.
Okay. I think we're off and running. So we'll take that from the top, and we'll start with some of the common mistakes that I see. And what we're trying to do ultimately is cash in all the work that you've done to get to race day and make sure that you get rewarded for all that work. So we'll start with some things that happen pre-race and how to avoid them. Burning too much energy before the start. And this starts race week, and it goes all the way through right before the race is going to start and the gun goes off. The nervous energy that you have, especially if you've reduced your training level, is pretty significant. And your mind can get into a loop thinking about the race all the time. You can overcompensate for the extra energy you have because you're not running as much, and do all kinds of crazy things, take on projects around the house or at work. And by the time the race rolls around, you're just fatigued and tired and don't have the energy to get through it. On race morning, one of the things that I do, because having been a runner for 40 years, I would like to think I go to a race and I'm ice cold, I'm nice and calm and relaxed. I'm not. I still get nervous when I go to a race, because at this point, if I'm racing, it's important to me. And I calm myself down by watching other people. And I can see other people kind of losing their mind and doing silly stuff, and it just calms me down, makes me laugh a little bit. But also the other thing that really helps is knowing exactly what I'm going to do on race day. I know the logistics, I know the warm up, I know the routine. And by doing that, it's just, what's the next step? What's the next step? So we want to get to that start line with all of that energy bottled, and you're going to spend it over the race distance. The next is arriving at the start line too light. And when people talk about weight and running, typically somebody's going to expect I'm talking about you need to get lean and mean, and well, all that's fine. But what I'm talking about here is making sure that you are heavy enough at the start line. I started really tracking this a few years ago with myself and with others, and it became very predictable. If somebody had a bad day in training or on race day, if that was somebody who was weighing themselves on a consistent basis, and yes, that can stir up the crazy, so there might be some things we need to do to get around that. But if they started a long run, or especially a long race light, we know that they're dehydrated to start with. We know that their glycogen stores are probably not full, so they're a little bit low on fuel. And if you start a marathon at your normal weight, you got a shot. If you're down a pound or two, you're making this a whole lot more difficult. We might as well add miles to the marathon. Even a half marathon, anything of significant distance, if you start a little bit light, it's going to be more difficult. So I would encourage people to keep an eye on weight and make sure that they're hydrated. Make sure you know what that weight should be. I know right now when I get on the scale what number I want to see. I try to guess what that number is going to be based on how I think I've done over the last so many hours. And it's just a really big deal. So I encourage you to keep an eye on that. We all go into races with expectation. And when somebody tells me I want to run this time, I say, great. What are you basing that on? What evidence do you have that you can run that fast? And I want them to have some kind of, you may see my office partner here. My dog is climbing up on the table here. I want them to have evidence based on their training, based on races that they've already run, why they think they can run that pace. Because one of the surest ways to run a race is have a wish list and have a wish pace and say, I want to break 4 hours for a marathon, even though there's absolutely no evidence that you can do that. And we want to make sure going into that you have a goal pace and you have some kind of idea of why you think you can run that. The next falls into that category of being hyper focused on splits. And you can see these people, if you stand at a marathon and you're at different spots along the course, you can see them looking at their watch every 6 steps. And they're worried about, what pace am I on? What's my current running pace? What's my average running pace? And they're so worried about that, they're not taking into account how they actually feel. And yes, you should have some kind of idea of what pace you're going to run. But if you're too hyper focused on splits, you start making bad decisions because you're trying to hit a number. And you're trying to hit that number, whether it's uphill with the wind, against the wind, if it's a fast part of the course, slow part of the course, if it's warmer than you anticipated, and that's a sure disaster waiting to happen. So have an idea of what you want to run. And I know one of the best 2 marathons I ran, as far as how they felt, interestingly enough, were the 2 fastest. And both of them, I remember looking at my watch when the split would hit, and I was literally saying to myself, close enough, I'll take it. Because it was within a couple of seconds of what I would hope to run. And if it was a little bit slow, I was thinking, they were both in Chicago. I was thinking, well, we're out here into the wind. This is going to be a little bit slow. Close enough, I'll take it. And then the further I got, the more concerned I was about time. And then you start doing the math of, what can I run here for the last few miles?
And Matt, we had a question. You mentioned significant distance. What would you consider significant distance?
Depends a little bit on the person. I have some people that hardly get out of bed for 26.2. For others like me, a long way to go. So I would say anything in terms of dehydration, which I think is the origin of that question, I would say anything over an hour. That becomes significant because dehydration, glycogen depletion both play a role at those levels. As you know, having run both marathons and half marathons, if you make a fueling mistake in a half marathon, you can kind of fake it and still get through it and lose a couple minutes. In a marathon, that really adds up. So it's just magnified the longer you go. But I'd say anything over an hour.
Thank you.
So one of the projects that I've given a couple of my runners, especially when I find that they're hyper split focused, is to associate how they want to feel during a race with those splits. And I had one woman who took that homework very seriously, and she wrote down every mile how she wanted to feel and what she wanted to think about. Now, she's smarter than me, of course, so maybe she could remember 26 things. I certainly couldn't. So I would break it down into the first 5 miles, the second 5 miles, or what have you. But if you can associate how you expect this to feel, you can look at your watch and say, this is faster than I expected, but I feel good. I've checked in with myself. My breathing's comfortable. I'm relaxed. It's my day. I'm going to go faster than I planned on. Or I'm a little bit slow, but it's also feeling a lot harder than I anticipated. I'm going to stay right here for a little while, maybe back off. I'll check back in another mile or two and see if maybe that was just a rough patch that I was going through. But associate that. So you know early on, this should feel relatively comfortable. Late in a race, okay, this is going to be rough. This is the end of the race. This is when I'm pushing. So, and anticipate it, expect it. And when that happens, we know from probably personal experience, but also from countless studies, somebody can handle a lot more discomfort or downright pain if they know how long it's going to last and they expected it. If it comes on at the wrong time, or you don't know that there's an endpoint to it, it's much more difficult to manage. So have those expectations of how you're going to feel along the way, and see if those splits are matching up. If not, you need to adjust the plan during the race. This is one I didn't have to talk about when I started coaching 30 years ago, but it's kind of a big deal now. Trusting GPS a little bit too much. Now, we know that you've run the mini and you probably run monumental and you're around tall buildings and the first couple miles are off. Or Jim, I know that you were in this category of people that I've coached that run Chicago that refuse to take the bridge and they all go across the river at a few points during the race.
Yep.
GPS is not following exactly where you run. So especially when there's tall buildings around it, in those situations, take it with a grain of salt. If you see a really crazy fast split, before you get too excited or you just stop and walk because you're going too fast, look around. Okay, there's a lot of things that can be happening around me. My GPS signal might have gone down that alley and back, and that's adding distance and of course making the split faster. So take that with a grain of salt. If it's a race that you know that you can trust, Carmel Marathon, Monumental Marathon, those kind of things, I would even turn your auto split off and just take the manual splits. That way you know what they actually are. Worst case scenario happened to one of my runners a few years ago. She's watching her GPS and it's telling her she's got it. She's going to qualify for Boston. She's got just a little bit of room to spare. And then about 400 meters before the finish, her watch says she's at 26.2. Well, the BAA doesn't care what your watch says. It cares what the timers say. So it can get down to a pretty close margin at the end. And she thought she had it. She said, I could have pushed a little bit more, but I knew I had it. So I was going to relax and enjoy it, and missed it by a few seconds. So GPS is a great tool, but don't trust it too much, especially on race day. So as a coach, I've spent a lot of time telling people to stay relaxed and comfortable at the beginning of races, right? If you've ever run with somebody slower than you in a race, and let's say they're maybe a minute a mile slower than you, and you decide I'm going to pace them. Sometimes after those races, you feel worse than if you would have raced yourself. And the reason for that is some of the things that we do to slow ourselves down is we start bouncing. And you're going up and down. So you're taking more pounding than if you're running your normal pace. And you're just tearing up your legs running slow. I can't think of a worse situation than running slower and feeling more beat up. So if you're going to try to run slow, make sure that your cadence is relatively normal. It might be a little bit lower, but try to keep that cadence and just be aware of, am I bouncing up and down? Because you certainly don't want to hold back a little bit early on, give away some time, so to speak, and then also feel like you ran faster than you did. We're going to go back to hydration here. I'll talk about marathon and half marathon. I know at this point, many people are thinking half marathon, but we're going to use this for Carmel Marathon, Monumental Marathon, and some others. So I'm going to talk about that as well. The calories needed for a marathon are usually at the end. You can store roughly 20 miles worth of calories. It's that last 10K where you have that deficit. Unfortunately, you can't get to 20 miles and have a snack and take in all those calories you need. You need to take them in along the way because your tank keeps getting a little bit lower in hydration and also glycogen. And as that gets lower, if you take something in, you bump it back up. So it's lowering and emptying at a little bit slower rate. So when you get to 6 miles to go, you still have 6 miles of calories left and you can get through it. So make sure that you're taking that in early. And one of the things I like to think about with hydration now, because I know I was always told, especially when I started running longer races than the 10K kind of stuff that I did in college and around that time, was people always told me to drink, but it was kind of an ambiguous thing. And I didn't really understand how much. I know my first mini marathon, I think it was 1988, everybody told me you got to drink a lot of water. So I drank a lot of water and I got on the track. And this is back in the day when it finished on the track, about 2 miles or so on the track. And my stomach was just waves of all that I had to drink that day. And I had to slow down because I had too much to drink and it's sitting in my stomach. Lesson learned, don't drink that much. But how much should you? So that's something we won't get into here, but you should have that figured out and it should be something systematic. It's got to be a flexible plan. If your plan says I need 8 ounces every 30 minutes, well, it might be 6, it might be 10, whatever, but you know that there's a target for that. And you know you need to do it early enough. I've said often that, especially for marathons, if you could carry around an IV that had sugar, salt, and water in it, and it was coming into your system the same rate that it was leaving your system, marathoning sure would be a whole lot easier. So think of it in those terms. I want a little bit throughout. I want to make sure that I start early so I don't have to play catch up, because you can't really catch up. When you go to the really long stuff, you have a long enough day that, as someone once told me, the beauty of ultra marathon is you can bonk and recover. You can't do that at half marathon and marathon. You need to make sure that you're getting in those amounts regularly. And right now, as we're sitting about 10 days before the Carmel Marathon, maybe it's the first really warm day that a lot of people run in. They need to be on top of it. You need to be on top of it early. By the time you're thirsty, by the time you think I might have trouble, you're already in trouble. I know there's studies out there that will contradict that and say your thirst mechanism is adequate. I'm here to tell you I've come across a lot of people where it's not. So practice that, be aware of that, and start early. During a race, you can go through a lot of emotions, especially if you have put a lot into preparing for a race. If it's your first half marathon or first marathon, or one that's really important to you, or the first one back for a long time, you can have emotional swings during the race. And it's important to know, and you know this from training, you know this from previous racing, is that there's days you start and you just don't feel that great. It can go away. It can come back and you can feel really good. You can end up having a really good day. You can feel good, and then for some reason you're not feeling so good. Maybe you're just a gel short. You take that and you start feeling better. But ride through those waves and just have that hope that, okay, I know what to do. I know from training when this happened. For example, when people start taking gels, they say, I can't take gels because that upsets my stomach. Well, enough experience will tell you, I'll take a gel, and for 3 or 4 minutes, my stomach's not real happy with me. But after that amount of time, I start feeling more energized. I feel better again. My stomach is fine, and it's all good. And if you've gone through that in training, you can expect it. But those waves will come of good and bad. Just ride through them, make the adjustments as you need to, and then you're going to be fine, and it will come around. Going for broke. Any good racer, any impressive performance, it will come down to, at some point, you put it on the line and you go for broke, and you go for everything you're worth. The longer the race, the less likely that is from the gun. So figuring out, when can I trust myself? When do I feel good enough to go? And going back to a previous slide, to associate how you want to feel at points in the race with your splits, because you might feel really good at the beginning and you're going a little bit too fast and you're relaxing, and okay, I can go a little bit faster. I'm fine doing that. Other days you're not so sure and you should hold back. What we want to avoid is going for broke off an emotional high. The adrenaline at these races is incredible. You're standing there at the start line and everybody's standing around you. You know you have all this in common. You know you've trained really hard. The gun goes off and you're trying to hold back and you just can't. And you just know you're out too fast. You know it while you're doing it and you can't hold back. So relaxing, teaching yourself, relax. Let me do this on adrenaline alone, because if I'm putting in effort and adrenaline early, it's too much. The other thing that can happen is getting so set, and this is a previous slide as well, on a time. I'm gonna try to break 3 hours come hell or high water, and you're in 3:02 shape, but you end up running 3:19 because you tried to break 3. Take what the day has to offer. In a half marathon, I think halfway is about 15K. And I've stood outside of the Speedway enough years at the Mini where you can see people coming in looking like $1 million. And then they come out and it's a completely different runner and they are wrung out. So there's some point along the way where if they would have held back a little bit longer, they would have had a much better day. Marathon, where's halfway? We know mathematically it's 13.1, but we know from an energy standpoint and effort standpoint, it's far beyond that. For a marathon, I tell somebody, wait till 16. And at 16, if you're ready to go, you can start pushing. And how do you know if you're ready to go? If you get to 16 miles, you can't fool yourself at 16 miles into a marathon. If you're at 16 and you think, all right, only 10 to go, it's your day, go for it. If you get to 16 and you think, oh my goodness, 10 more miles to go, okay, you got to go into management mode, make sure you're getting everything that you need, relax, just get another mile in the bank, okay? So figure out, when can I turn this loose? Something else I thought that we would talk about are pace teams. I coordinate pace teams for monumental races. And in doing that, we've had some outstanding pacers that could wake up in the middle of the night and go run whatever pace you wanted to run. We've had some others that maybe didn't have such a good day pacing. It happens. But then the people that are with them, that's obviously my concern, is making sure people have good races. So we've already talked about getting committed to a pace, no matter how you feel, has ruined a lot of races. So make sure that you're using this pacer as, okay, this is kind of a measuring stick. This is kind of where I want to be. But you don't have to start and finish with a pacer. There's no rules about this. You can use a pacer at the beginning just to hold back. You might say, this is my speed limit. I will not pass the 3:30 marathon pacer until I get to whatever mile. And you can use them as a governor and then take off after that. Or at least you have to come to a conscious decision that you're going to go faster than that. So that's fine. You might let them go and chase them down. One of my favorite stories, and I tell this all the time, my wife and her friend wanted to break 3:20 a few years ago in the marathon. And we had a 3:20 pacer that they kind of had an eye on at the start. They let him go. They finally reeled him in at about 22 miles, and they ran 3:18. So they didn't cross paths with this 3:20 guy until 4 miles to go, and then they made up even more time. So use them how you need to, okay? Also, don't get mad at your pacers, and don't expect a pacer to hit every mile evenly. You really don't want them to. If this mile's into the wind, if you hit the same pace as you did when you had the wind at your back, you're going to be working way too hard. So a good pacer will keep you there. Your cumulative pace should be really good, but a pace here or there, of course, we don't want to have wild swings, but don't worry too much about it. And if your pacer's having a rough day, abandon ship. Find somebody else that was in that pace group and say, hey, our pacer's having a rough day. We know we want to run 9-minute pace for this thing. Let's dial in together and work together. So there's a couple things that you can do to avoid some of the common problems that people have. And there's another thing I like to say, run smart, run hard, and get things happen. So any questions that I can answer for you?
Hey, Matt, I've got one. I had not saw this, and someone mentioned to me the other day, and I don't know if they're accurate or not, but as I've trained for both bowls and halves, on my nutrition, I use the carb boom. So during the race, I've taken those at the same sequence every 3 or 4 miles, whether it was a half marathon or full marathon. And someone said, no, Jim, you should be taking it in quicker in a half than a full because you're burning it quicker. And I said, that makes a lot of sense. I need to look into that.
The caloric need to cover 13 miles, I'm going to say something really brilliant here, is less than the caloric need to run 26.2. You can store a good amount of glycogen, and the harder you go, the faster you're burning it. So you're not burning the same rate at a shorter high intensity race. You're burning at a much faster rate. But you can store pretty much the calories that you need for a half marathon. I would still say take one, maybe two, but you don't need to take this the same way that you would take it in a marathon. Typically, for a half marathon, somewhere around 15K, I think is a good place.
Okay.
If somebody's trained with it and they've raced with it and they like it a little bit more often, that's fine. I would encourage people, even if I think they just need one gel during the half marathon, I would encourage them to have two, because if your stomach's not having a particularly cooperative day, you might only want half of that. And maybe you take half at 7 and then you take the other half at 11. And that way you're still getting the calories in. But yeah, you shouldn't need quite as much during the half marathon.
Okay.
The hydration rate is going to be a little more similar, but even that isn't quite as big of a deal because we're trying to get to the finish line before we get to a critical point where it has started to get too low. And the way that I think about hydration now is it is the original legal blood doping, because what we know about hydration is that's the way that everything gets to where it needs to be. If you're dehydrated, your nutrients, your carbohydrate that you're taking in can't get across the cells. If you don't have enough salt, you can't get the water into the cells to properly hydrate. So everything starts with good hydration, and then you can deliver oxygen. Your muscles are a lot happier. They're getting the fuel that they need. So that hydration is really important. I know it gets a lot of lip service. It has forever. But to figure that out individually, how much you need, it is, as I said before, it's a very big deal. So do that for both distances, but the gels, you probably don't need quite as much for the half.
Thanks.
How much carbohydrate should you have the morning of the race? Before, obviously.
There's some personal variation on that, but let me tell you what I typically recommend, and if it doesn't work, then we make adjustments, is I would find the breakfast that you do all the time. I would find a breakfast that travels well. So when you go to a race, you don't have to go find this. You don't have to find somewhere open to get it. The two things that I use a lot are peanut butter and jelly sandwich or a Cliff Bar. And it's a good mix of fat, carbohydrate, and protein. So you're not taking in a bunch of simple sugar, high glycemic index that burns real fast. You need something that's going to sit there a little bit. If you're used to it, typically it goes down. We know that food doesn't go down quite as well when you have a stomach full of butterflies on race morning. So you want something that's comfortable and you're used to. And typically that's going to be 200 to 400 calories at the most. And the other big thing is how early do you need to take it? And back in the good old days, people would wake up 3 hours before, have their pancake breakfast and do all of that. I found if I eat one of those two things an hour before, my stomach is fine, I'm ready to go. And as my friend Jackie Dykes likes to say, train your gut. And people that say, well, I can't eat breakfast or I can't take gels. Well, everything's trainable. And that's something that we can train. So I would look for 200 to 400 calories. Now, that's assuming you took in some good nutrients the day before and you're just topping off the tank.
Thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions?
Yes, one more. So
Sure.
Kathy and I are the pace group leaders for a wide range of paces from, what are we, Kathy, 11 to 16. So 11:01 to 16:59 is our people. And a lot of them are first time marathoners. And of course, there's a lot of lore that goes with the half marathon. And one is carbo loading the night before, which I personally have never found helpful for a half marathon or a marathon either. But given that our group tends to be older and slower, and so you can be out there for 6 hours on marathon day. And then also on half marathon day, it's obviously shorter, but do you really need to do the carbo loading the night before?
The brief history of carbo loading, I'll throw that in and then we can get to your specific question, was that a week before the marathon, you'd have a depletion run, you wouldn't have any carbohydrates, you would get the tank down to empty. And then you could binge. And they found that your body absorbed more carbohydrates, so you could store more glycogen. And then the same people that did that research did it again, but they did it a little bit different way and found if you add a little bit of carbohydrate the days leading up to the race, it does about the same thing. And you don't get so grouchy after having your glycogen depletion. So maybe adding a little bit more carbohydrate, especially if somebody's restricting it and in their diet, they're trying to cut out more sugars, their carbohydrate is a little bit low and you're coming into a race, maybe we're adding more. To essentially binge the night before, I think is a pretty bad idea. And this is also something that I would want people to rehearse. And I'm very boring on Friday night because I have the same thing because I know it works. I know I feel good for a long run the next day. But knowing those things and typically having some carbohydrate, great, do it. Have a little bit of protein with it, pasta and chicken or faux chicken if you're vegan or vegetarian. And that should be fine. You don't need to take in the 2,500 calories the night before that you're going to need in the marathon. So no, I would just say your best normal diet. And the normal part is very important as well.
Matt, what do you have on Friday night?
I have pasta with a faux chicken patty. My wife is vegan and it's kind of rubbed off on me there.
Yeah.
And I have some cottage cheese with it and marinara sauce, and that works really well. Very predictable, and I feel good and energetic if I do it. So, and somebody else might have the same thing. First, they might just hate the sound of what I have, but it might not work for them. So that's part of the experimenting and training your gut. But I think you're going to see a lot more generalities in what works for people than not.
Yeah, the whole
Did that
practicing
answer
is
your
so key, the practicing piece. It was back a couple months ago. I had a long run to do on a Saturday. My wife and I had gone out on Friday night to celebrate our first time out since during COVID. Had a big steak, potatoes. That was one of the most miserable long runs. For the second time in my life, I was several miles out going, I'm not going to make it home. What are my options to go to the bathroom now? What is the best option? None of them are good. What's the best one? So, yeah, your lesson learned again.
Well, I can tell you that that's the number one concern of older first time half marathoners and marathoners is bathroom. Like, where are the bathrooms? How
Yeah,
close to a bathroom? What are the issues there? And that it produces a lot of anxiety for people.
Mhm.
And it's not something that everybody talks about all the time either. So
I can tell you that is from the front of the pack to the back.
Really? Okay.
In dealing with elite athletes, that is a big deal. And yeah, so that's from the front to the back. Everybody I deal with of every speed, that's a concern. For that group, I'm sure it's even more of a concern, but they're not alone. And by the way,
there should be as
you
many
two are very
porta
valuable.
potties as water stops.
I'm sorry, Allison?
Do you think there should be as many porta potties as water stops on a marathon run?
Well, I would certainly like my own porta john. So yes, there should be for every cup of water.
No, water stops, not water cups.
Well, I think more is better if you can do it.
Yeah.
I doubt there's ever been a post-race survey that said you had too many porta johns. You had too many water stops and too many porta johns.
Yeah.
Those go right along with the course was too fast. I didn't like it. So yes, more is better.
It is a concern. And Matt knows this, when I ran Chicago 2 years ago, I had to pee at mile 5 and mile 6, mile 7. Every time I went by a porta john, I'm like, and finally at mile 9, I thought, I'm going to be miserable or I'm going to stop. And so I stopped. And yeah, it probably was a minute or two out of my race, but I think I got probably a boost of energy because I had a breather. So in the end, it didn't, I'm going to call it coming out in the wash, but it was stupid not to. And so Nina, your question is good because as we get older, as I get older, I'm seeing that, too. So I had not thought about that, but I'm definitely glad you raised that question a minute. And I'm glad his answer was, hey, it's from the front to the back.
I heard somebody say one time, talking to first timers about what to do when you get to a race. First thing you do is you find the Porta John line. You get in line. Once you go, you get in the back of the line because you're going to have to go again. So you just keep doing that until the race starts. And so it is universal.
With chip races, you don't necessarily have to be right there at the start line.
There you go. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
I've been in there a few times during the start, so experience.
Well, we are about 20 late, and so I've killed you all past, but it was a great conversation. I'll call out one last time if there's any other questions, and if not, we will let Matt go and we'll call it an evening. Anybody else?
Thank you, Matt. Yeah.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. I appreciate the
Yeah.
good questions.
Matt, it was excellent. As always, we definitely appreciate not only tonight, but you're being a friend of the Indy runners, but just a friend of the running community in general. So I thank you for all you do, especially this last year or so and how tough it's been on everybody. So I appreciate it.
Thanks,
Thank
Jim.
you all.
Yep. Thanks so much, Matt.
Thank you. Good running.
Thanks.
Bye.
And Matt, I think you can either stop the recording or when you log off, it'll stop it. Either way. And it goes off into the cloud and Trina gets it.